6 years ago, peaceful protesters took to the streets of a modern, complex, multicultural country, Syria. But what some had hoped would be a Syrian spring instead deteriorated into the horrifying civil war that's claimed more than 400,000 lives. Journalist Janine di Giovanni watched the early unraveling of this crisis and chronicles it in her new book. It's called The Morning They Came for Us: Dispatches from Syria. She is Middle East editor at Newsweek and a contributing editor for Vanity Fair. And Janine di Giovanni joins us now via Skype from Paris, France. It's a great pleasure to meet you, even in this way. And as I told you just moments ago before we started this, yours is undoubtedly the most harrowing account of any war I've ever read. I guess I want to start with, when you first went over to Damascus, Syria, what did you think you would be covering when you went?
I wasn't sure what kind of war this was going to be, because it had started as a peaceful revolution that then had fallen into the abyss of an armed conflict, and then as time went on, got worse and worse and worse. And I was fresh from covering the Arab Spring, which in Tunisia and Egypt at that point were successful, more or less. I still believe in many ways the Arab Spring has yet to be determined. I don't think it's been a failure. But what happened in Syria was not the same as what happened in Tunisia and in Egypt. Very quickly, it spiraled into a violent conflict, one of the worst, probably the worst I've ever seen in more than 25 years of reporting war, and the most cynical as well, as it's become a deeply cynical proxy war, where each party has their own interest at stake, to the point where what the Syrian people need and want isn't even considered anymore.
Let's read a bit of an excerpt from how you describe the beginnings of this war. Here's from your book, The Morning They Came for Us. The pool party at my hotel that Thursday in early summer 2012 seemed to betoken the last days of a spoiled empire that was about to implode. Smoke was rising in the background from shelling in the southern suburbs, and a gaunt Russian Natasha was dancing clumsily near the pool, oblivious to the explosions. Syrian women with complicated hairstyles involving hairpieces and extensions, blow dryings and colored gels paraded in full makeup, bikinis, and high heels. The men wore Vilebrequin-style swimming trunks and drank Lebanese beer with a lime down the neck of a bottle and a salt-rimmed glass. I stood on my balcony and watched the smoke from the bombings in the suburbs, but I also looked at the bacchanalian scene below, at the denial of the beginnings of the drum roll of war. Obviously, Janine, many Syrians were in complete denial that the conflict was about to boil over. I note that you have said that the wars that you have covered in the past started with a kind of a jolt. Did Syria have a similar kind of jolt?
What was interesting is, as I was actually watching that scene, the pool party, it was a Thursday afternoon pool party, it was absolutely surreal. Homs was burning. There was bombing in Homs. People were starving. People were dying. And, the distance between Homs and Damascus is about an hour down a highway. So for me, it was just this surreal moment of watching people who were desperately trying to cling to the last semblance of ordinary life, which is normal, I have to say. I really have to point out that I think that people identify with what they want their lives to be. No one wants to admit that their country is about to break up into a million pieces, into a violent civil war. And it does happen very quickly. It's what happened in Bosnia and in other countries in Africa that I've lived in. The quickness that a war can descend and how swiftly it turns from peacetime to wartime is really staggering. And I think that's why many people, I've worked with a lot of refugees, they wait till the very last minute before they flee, because no one wants to leave their home. No one wants to leave their country. No one wants to be a refugee. So you're going to really hang on to your last bit of ordinary life. And I think in many ways that's human nature.
How did you notice the population of Syria begin to divide itself into various factions?
That also happened very quickly. working on the opposition side, you could see, just being a reporter and observing, the checkpoints changing. So around 2012, the end of 2012, you could see that the checkpoints weren't really manned by Free Syrian Army, who were, of course, the soldiers who were the beginning of the opposition defenders, into more jihadists. And that was the very beginning of the Islamic State and al-Nusra, the al-Qaeda franchise in Syria, who keep changing their name, by the way, but I still refer to them as al-Nusra. And you could see just by the checkpoints who was controlling what parts of the city, and also for me, by the way that the local people treated me. On one of my last trips to Aleppo, I was staying with a group of fighters, and they didn't want me to come out of my room to eat. They brought the food to me and left it in front of my door because I was a woman. And I could feel the tension. I could feel things changing in the city. I could feel there was more Sharia courts. There was more radicalism. And this was, of course, a result of the factioning of the opposition, which then basically divided into, I mean, one analyst said more than 1,000 different militias. I think that's a bit of an exaggeration, but certainly hundreds and hundreds of different factions within the opposition, all being funded by different parties, by Qatar, by Saudi, by Turkey, by the US, at that point, the US-backed opposition fighters, by the Free Syrian Army. And instead of being one fighting force, there were many. They did have a common enemy, which was Bashar al-Assad, the president. And at one point then, when the Islamic State entered the picture, they were fighting against the Islamic State.
Just curious, when you're reporting from more religious areas, do you cover your head with a hijab or something like that?
I do.
You do?
I always do. I mean, I think it's just a matter of being respectful. I have been in situations, I mean, most notably in Gaza, interviewing Hamas figures who said to me when I came with a hijab, take that off. You're not a believer. You don't have to wear it. But I think it's always for female reporters to be as respectful as possible. And that means covering yourself. And I have, in certain instances, even men have said to me, your hair is showing. You've got to cover this part of your hair. But I do. And I've worked in places where I've had to wear a complete abaya as well, which is the whole covering. Not a burqa where my face is covered, but where my whole body is covered.
Understood. Let's bring, I want to bring a map up right now and just give people a sense of the complexity of what you have been trying to report on. As we suggested in the intro, 400,000 dead now, almost 5 million refugees, dozens and dozens of different groups in conflict with one another throughout Syria. And I want to follow up on something that you said in an earlier answer to an earlier question. We think of this as a civil war, but I wonder if that's more accurate to say, or is it more accurate to say that this is, in fact, a proxy war for a lot of different interests in a lot of different countries in a lot of different places?
Well, Steve, I think at this point it's a proxy war. I think we have to be very pragmatic about it. Since Russia entered the picture in 2015, and Iran, of course, which has always been backing Bashar al-Assad, it's a very clear, almost in a sense, a new Cold War. I mean, Russia very saw an opportunity where the U.S. was backing off, and Britain and the West really did not want to get involved in Syria, decided to come into the picture. And since they did, at the end of September 2015, there's been an entirely different dimension, which is why when Hillary Clinton was campaigning and she would say, we should have a no-fly zone, by that point it was pretty redundant. Once the Russians were involved, you could not have a no-fly zone, because if you shot down a Russian plane, that's an act of war. So I think the dimensions and the level and the profoundness of this war went to an even deeper dimension once Russia got involved.
You were embedded with the Syrian Arab Army, and I want to ask a question about that because, now this may seem ridiculous to ask this, but you know, one is always perplexed at how brother can take up arms against brother. And I wonder how Did you notice any hesitation even on the part of the Syrian soldiers in laying waste and or killing their fellow citizens?
Well, they don't see it like that, in the same way that they wouldn't see Aleppo falling on December 16th, 2016. To them, Aleppo did not fall into government hands. Aleppo was liberated from jihadists. So this is all perspective. Assad and his Russian counterparts see this as a war against terrorism. And they see themselves as liberators, liberating people against terrorism. Now, to be completely fair to the Damascus regime, many people I knew in Damascus who initially in 2011, 2012 were supporting the opposition ceased to support them once the jihadist element grew more and more intense. Once the Islamic State began kidnapping journalists, kidnapping foreigners, executing them, imposing Sharia law, torturing children, this incident where they had a Jordanian pilot in a cage and they lit it on fire in Raqqa, all of these absolute brutal, inhumane acts. A lot of people backed off supporting the opposition. And while I won't say they gave their alliance to President Assad, they certainly would prefer to see President Assad remain in power than to see ISIS, the Islamic State, in Damascus. So this was a big shift. And I think for me, what it really showed was that more than anything, people want to protect themselves. They want to protect their families. They want to get their kids to school. They want to have as normal lives as possible. There's very few people that really have a political stance. It's much more about, at this point, with the war so deeply embedded into the mentality and with so many casualties, so many refugees, it's now more about how do we survive?
Any idea how many journalistic colleagues you've lost to covering this war?
Steve Sutloff, Marie Colvin, Jim Foley. Jim Foley and Steve Sutloff were killed by ISIS, beheaded. Marie Colvin and a French journalist, Remy, were killed in Homs in 2012. There's been more. I mean, local, like, let's not forget that often when we say how many journalists have died, we think of Western, foreign reporters. Mm-hmm. But there are many, many, and this were in particular Syrian reporters that we have relied on because they're the eyes and ears on the ground right now. When we can't get in, they're the ones giving us information. And many of them have been killed, have been put in prison, have been tortured. This is, I think, the Committee to Protect Journalists has said it is the most dangerous war for reporters.
Well, I don't know if I should ask you this, but I'm going to anyway. How about you? How close have you come to being kidnapped or killed?
You know, Syria is the most complicated war I've ever reported. In Bosnia, in all of the African wars I've worked in Afghanistan, in Iraq, even in Chechnya, which up until now I think was the most dangerous place I've ever worked. Again, Russian bombardment. You took, in a sense, it was up to you. You could go to front lines. It was you were taking the risk. And if you were killed by a bomb or by a sniper, then it was your decision. The whole kidnapping element has introduced a whole new level of fear. Journalists have now become a commodity to be bought and sold. The danger of this is that when journalists are kidnapped, or aid workers, I don't want to just say journalists, or even local people, ISIS or other jihadist groups demand huge amounts of money. It is illegal for the British government, the American government, and I believe the Canadian government to pay ransom for hostages. However, the Italian government and the French government do pay and have paid to release their hostages. What that means is that journalists are basically walking ATM machines, cash distributors. So this is a really horrifying prospect. And I was just on a book tour in Australia with a colleague, a friend of mine, and the two of us have worked everywhere, Chechnya, Iraq, and really faced some incredibly dangerous situations together. And he said to me, neither one of us want to end up in the boot of a car. This is what it comes down to. I mean, kidnapping just brings a whole nother level to it. So reporting the Syrian war is extremely frustrating because for field reporters, which is what I am, I need to be with people. I need to talk to them. I need to get them to explain to me how they're living, how they're surviving, what they're eating, what kind of weapons are being used against them, what kind of violations they're undergoing, how their children are going to school, how they're feeding their families, how they're making bread. I mean, all these things are crucial details that I need. And it's, let's just say, reporting the war in Syria has been extremely, extremely challenging for all of us.
Janine, I told you off the top that this was probably the most harrowing book about war that I'd ever read. And you know, on the one hand, you know, I don't want to be overly grotesque here with our viewers, but on the other hand, you know, you put those details about rape and torture in the book for a reason. You want people to know what's going on over there. And so I wonder whether you can help us understand the role that rape and torture play in what's going on, but maybe spare us some of the most grotesque details in doing so. Can you help us there?
Yes, I can. And thank you for what you said. I mean, what I am trying to do, in a sense, is I don't have to shock people because the facts are shocking enough. What actually happens on the ground is deeply disturbing. So what I try to do is to get as much evidence and detail as I can, in a sense, because what I ultimately want is for the perpetrators of this violence to eventually be brought to justice. We saw this happen in Bosnia, in very small cases, not enough, in Kosovo. And recently I got an email from a prosecutor at one of the war crimes tribunals who's investigating something that happened 17 years ago that I wrote about in Kosovo during the war. 17 years ago. It's a long time, but it does show that sometimes the long arm of justice does get these guys, and they can't get away with it. Back to your question, these are horrific stories. Torture is the lowest that a human being can go to, both the person administering the torture and the person receiving it. But the people who told me their stories did it for a reason. It's almost as though they don't want anyone to ever forget what happened to them. Because in a sense, if you forget, if you lose these stories, then it's almost as though they didn't happen. So when people talk to me, I've never forced anyone to talk to me. I've never been the kind of reporter that holds a microphone in someone's face and says, you know, how do you feel? Usually they come to me, or I find them through various means, and I spend a long, long time with them. You really, especially with a rape victim, you need to establish a lot of trust, and you need to have a lot of patience. So you need to sit down on the floor with them or wherever. You need to smoke cigarettes, you need to drink a lot of tea, and take the time and get the details, which are often, as you said, gruesome, but they're important. In some instances about the torture in my book, I needed to check. They were so horrifying to me that I actually had to go and check with several doctors. Could this have happened, and could this person have survived? Unfortunately, I was led to the conclusion that the person who was telling me this one story, it was true. So it's very hard for me to write about these things, and it's very hard for me to sleep at night after I spend weeks, months, years doing this. And it's been many years I've been doing this now, but I think it's important. And I think it's important mainly because I don't want these people ever to be forgotten. And I don't want what happened to them ever to be forgotten. And if in some ways it prevents it from happening in the future to someone else, then I've done my job.
Let's do another excerpt from Dispatches from Syria. What does the war in Aleppo smell of? It smells of carbine, of wood smoke, of unwashed bodies, of rubbish rotting, of the heady smell of fear. The rubble on the street, the broken glass, the splintered wood that was once somebody's home. On every corner there is a destroyed building that may or may not have bodies still buried underneath. Your old school is gone. So are the mosque, your grandmother's house, and your office. Your memories are smashed. I just wonder how Syrians manage to go about living their daily lives surrounded by so much chaos. How do they do it?
I think what I was trying to get put across when I wrote that was, what would it be like for you or me? How would we live? How would we survive if the school you went to was destroyed, if your home was destroyed, if half your family was in exile as refugees and the other half were killed? I just want to put across this, what it's like to lose all sense of normality and how surreal it is. But how most people have an inherent resilience. They want to survive, especially if there's children involved. They want to keep their kids alive. They want to be able to get them food. This also introduces another level, which is helplessness. I've seen so many parents, mothers or fathers, fall into this horrific situation where they can't feed their kids or they can't get the medical care. And as a parent myself, I have to say, I mean, this is what really breaks me. One incident, I was in a hospital in Aleppo, a makeshift hospital, and a baby was brought in, a few days old, suffering from a respiratory illness, not even a gunshot wound or a shrapnel. It was a respiratory illness that could have been easily treated in Toronto, in New York, anywhere. Very simple with antibiotics. But there were no antibiotics, and there was no treatment, and the baby died in front of me. And watching the doctor work on him, and watching the doctor wrap this tiny body in a piece of white cloth and hand it to the mother, I really lost my composure. I started crying and crying. I had to leave the room because I didn't want the parents of the dead baby to see me crying because they weren't crying. But the fact that life is so cheap and life is so, it passes so quickly in these places, it broke my heart. And I think that is what you see over and over again. And another thing I always remember is I said to someone in Aleppo, what do you miss the most? And I always ask people this, what do you miss? Do you miss vacations? Do you miss being able to leave the country? Do you miss going to a bookstore and buying a new book? And he said, no, I miss watching football games with my family. Most of them are dead or are outside the country. I don't have electricity, so I don't have a television. And even if I wanted to, half my family are on the other side of town and they can't get here. We never get together because of the snipers and the bombing. So it's the tiny, tiny things people miss. In some of the besieged areas like Daraa, which is a suburb outside of Damascus, which was besieged for nearly 4 years. Children that grew up in that time never saw a piece of fruit. Really hard for us to imagine that. Or 6 years, a 6-year war. Well, what does that mean? That means that's an entire grammar school education. That is 6 years of someone's life, 6 years of memories. Writing this book, what I want more than anything is for people to put themselves in the shoes of these people and to say, what would I do if it was me? How would I respond? Would I be resilient? Would I collapse? Would I save other people? Would I try to help other people? Would I run away? How would I act? And I think that's mainly what I'm trying to get across.
Let's finish up on this, Janine. Can you imagine returning to Syria again someday soon to report on this conflict again?
Yes, I'm trying. I try every day. I send letters and messages to the Syrian government. So if any of them are watching, please, please let me come back, because I want to see how people are living, to document the everyday life of ordinary people. Of course, I would go back. And I also feel committed to certain people there who have lived through this for 6 years. And I think it's very important that journalists or international observers are there, because we need to be a witness to this. We need to document this for history.
The morning they came for us. Dispatches from Syria. Janine di Giovanni, it's been a great pleasure talking to you this evening on TVO. We wish you well. I would certainly commend this book to anybody who wants to know more about what's going on over there. It's just a great, great book. Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Good night.
Alla prossima, signora.
Help TVO create a better world through the power of learning. Visit TVO.org and make a tax-deductible donation today.